Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Print Speak. My name is Rebecca Travis, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the curator and collections manager here at Open Studio in Toronto. We are really excited to bring together artists Francisco-Fernando Granados, Gordon Trick, and Lesley Finlayson for this Print Speak session, Observation, Mark-Making Composition, Dialogues in Printmaking and Drawing, which is running in conjunction with Francisco's current exhibition With a Difference in our main gallery space, which results from his year-long residency at Open Studio. Before we begin the talk, I would like to do a land acknowledgement for where Open Studio is situated. Open Studio acknowledges that it is situated on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. They are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we continue to create and exist. Just an introduction about Open Studio and Print Speak, if you're joining us for the first time. We are an artist-run center dedicated to contemporary print, and we offer accessible, inclusive, and affordable printmaking facilities, programs, and services for artists and for the public, both in Canada and abroad. We support artists in creating and exhibiting contemporary print in an open-minded, safe, and collaborative environment, and our vision is to shape the exploration of print as essential, dynamic, and relevant to contemporary culture and to creative thought. Print Speak is a virtual education series that focuses on the incredible artists whose work pushes the boundaries of print media. These talks will take you on a journey with each artist to learn about their passion for creating. Just a quick reminder about Zoom, please put yourself on mute for the talk. And for the Q&A portion, you can put your questions in the chat or use the raised hand emoji and we'll get to you at that time. I'm just going to introduce our speakers for today. So Francisco-Fernando Granados was born in Guatemala and lives in Toronto, dish with one spoon territory. Since 2005, his practice has traced his movement from convention refugee to critical citizen, using abstraction performatively, site-specifically, and relationally to create projects that challenge the stability of practices of recognition. His work has developed from the intersection of visual arts training, working in performance through artist-run spaces, studies in queer and feminist theory, and early activism as a peer support worker with immigrant and refugee communities. This layering of different experiences has trained his intuitions to seek site-responsive approaches, alternative forms of distribution, and the weaving of lyrical and critical propositions. His exhibition project, Who Claims Abstraction, is currently on view at Simon Fraser University Galleries in Vancouver, and an accompanying book created with SFU and Publication Studio Vancouver titled Who Claims Abstraction With a Difference will be released in July 2023. Welcome, Francisco-Fernando. Gordon Trick was born and raised on the Canadian prairies during the 1950s and 60s. After being dissuaded from pursuing a career in art as he finished high school, Gordon took earth sciences at the University of Manitoba for 2 years before dropping out and hitting the road to see Canada. In 1973, he began taking figure drawing classes at night in Edmonton with the artist Peter Lewis, which was followed by a move to Calgary in 1975. His serious pursuit of studies in art at the University of Calgary began, finally culminating in a Master of Fine Arts degree with a double major in printmaking and drawing, during which time he met Lesley Finlayson in the MFA program. The two closely related media of drawing and printmaking, combined with some of the concepts retained from his brief education in geology, influenced his future processes and directions in art. Gordon taught drawing and printmaking courses at Langara College in Vancouver from 1989 till 2016, which is where he met Francisco-Fernando Granados. He is a double past president of Malaspina Printmakers Society in Vancouver, and he has exhibited locally, nationally, and internationally for over 3 decades. Welcome, Gordon. And finally, Lesley Finlayson. Lesley completed her BA Honours degree in Drawing and Painting at the Glasgow School of Art from 1978 to 82, followed by a postgrad year at the Cyprus College of Art in Paphos. In 1987, she moved to Canada to complete an MFA in Drawing at the University of Calgary. She taught advanced drawing and painting classes at Langara College in Vancouver for 23 years, and she now resides in Victoria, BC, where she continues her studio practice. In this Print Speak session, Francisco-Fernando, Gordon, and Lesley will discuss their work through intersections between printmaking and drawing. Throughout their individual practices, these connections involve different questions of embodied translation of experiences of space, And Granados traces his foundational understanding of both of these key mediums in his practice to his education in Gordon and Lesley classrooms at the Langara College Fine Arts program during the mid-2000s. So Francisco-Fernando, I'll hand across to you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And before I begin, I just want to thank everybody at Open Studio for the year that I've been allowed to spend there making this new work. So thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you to Heather, who was the costume printer who I worked with for the show, Putty, Pat, Laura. Thank you to Victoria Day as well, who also mentored me on a previous on an initial stage. And just to everybody who's in the studio. I think one of the really important things for me about printmaking, one of the things that I really learned while working in printmaking was how to be an artist in community. I'm going to share my screen and you can let me know. And this has all of our, this actually has all of our PowerPoints, both mine, Gordon, and Lesley. So, what I want to do with the time that I have is I want to kind of tell the story of the show that's at Open Studio, and I want to connect the story of the show at Open Studio with the reason I wanted to apply for the residency, and the reason I was so happy when I got the residency, which was that even though I have worked a lot in performance, even though I have worked a lot in very experimental forms, my foundation, and I would say my very first language as an artist, is drawing. And it really is during that time at Langara, working with Lesley and Gordon, learning with them, that I was able to be exposed to the best of what that language can give a person, that I was able to begin to practice it. And that I understood it in the way that I've sort of diagrammed in this way, which to me, whether it is with very traditional materials on a nice rag paper, or whether it is out in space with experimental materials, to me, what I call a drawing is anything, any kind of activity, artistic, perhaps not even made by an artist, but certainly when an artist is combining observation, composition, and mark making. And I would say that for me, the really important thing about finding this language is that I came to Langara at a time where I had just sort of finished the process of going from refugee claimant to convention refugee. And the very first thing that I did when I knew that my family would be allowed to stay in Canada was go up and look up fine arts programs in the Lower Mainland, because I lived in New Westminster, which is actually Halcomelin speaking territory. And as a note, I live in Toronto and Dish with One Spoon territory. My family lives in Halcomelin speaking territory, which is called New Westminster. And Gordon and Lesley are actually joining us from Songhees territory, which is Victoria. So having sort of landed from Guatemala, which is where I was born, and having learning that I would be allowed to set root here as a convention refugee and being on my way to citizenship, I felt, I think, a real need for belonging. And I was involved in, at that point, I was not yet involved in performance art, but I was certainly involved with the immigrant and refugee community. But the thing that made my experience at Langara really different is that I found drawing as a language. Anne Carson, the poet, begins a really beautiful book called Autobiography of Red, with a line that says that refugees are hungry for language and aware that anything can happen. And in the last couple of weeks, as I've been going over that line, I've been thinking more and more that going to Langara and finding drawing and, as an extension of it, printmaking, as a language that I could use, in a way, fed my hunger for a language that was neither the language of the place that I was coming from, nor the language of this place that I had landed in, but a language that felt all my own. This is some of the work that I did while at Langara. This is a drawing from Lesley's 8:30 in the morning Friday morning class with an incredible model called Peter, who would move very slowly. So the notion of movement and the idea of drawing being something that was alive was something that I think I started understanding from the very beginning. This is a soft ground etching from Gordon's intaglio class. That's actually a live drawing of my good friend Kevin and his friend, that I just did one day while we were hanging out, and I translated that into the soft ground edging. This is a painting from my second year course with Lesley, where I was beginning to think about abstraction. And one of the really important things that I learned at Langara was that just because you were leaving perhaps the figurative referent, just because you were perhaps no longer claiming to make an artwork that was a direct observation of a landscape or a direct observation of a figure, I remember understanding that your observation, your precision, your care towards the mark needed to be just as thoughtful, just as careful as if you were making a figurative work. So this was a really important time of, in a way, acquiring this language and beginning to speak in this language. I finished at Langara in around 2007 and took up performance art and in a way carried the logic of drawing into all of the performances that I did. In a way, I've never approached anything that I've done any differently from the way that I was taught to approach a picture plane. And so in a way that rehearsal as a student gave me the flexibility to, whether I was making some kind of study for a performance, which I sometimes drew, or whether I was, making a drawing in space, or like in the case of the show that we have at Open Studio right now, that way of approaching it, I think, has remained really consistent and has really grounded me. During 2020, I believe, while we were still between lockdowns, while things were really, really uncertain, I had left my job teaching at OCAD. I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. And as I was looking for things that I could, and sort of venues and contexts that I could make art work through, I came across the call for Open Studio, and some people that I really respected had done projects there. Erica De Freitas, Michelle Forsyth, Pascaline. I had a sense of the work that Open Studio was doing, and I knew that they had a really interesting combination of acknowledging print and the history of print as a medium, but also exploring generations of people that were thinking about it in perhaps a somewhat different way. And so I decided to apply, and I applied by saying that what I wanted to do in this residency was to find a way to reconnect with print and use it as the basis to make a new body of work. I have been working for the last 5 years on a series of abstract digital drawings that are called letters, that have accumulated an archive of about 400 compositions. And so the first thing that I did as I started the residency is I began to hand trace contours from some of those drawings on architectural paper. And I began to sort of lay them out to try to find different iterations, different combinations. At first, I thought that I might actually work in silkscreen because it was something that I had sort of worked in before. Did some experiments, and the quality of the line, like the idea that I had, which was to translate a digital drawing that was a sort of key composition within this archive of 400 drawings, to translate it into lines and then find different ways of embodying that drawing. Serigraphy was not exactly the printmaking medium for that, and so at Rebecca and Putty's advice, after sort of having a conversation with them, we decided to reach out to Heather Thompson, the costume printer, and the translation that I was able to achieve from this very soft, atmospheric drawing with all of these interlocking lines into this much more sort of linear, quite highly contrasting composition, that became the basis of the exhibition. I should say that this residency took place in 2021 and a little bit in 2022, and it was actually a period of what felt like a lot of things being really tense, especially in Toronto, because of lockdowns, because of political things that were happening with downtown Toronto being sort of inaccessible because of protests that were happening, the convoy protests. And so even the journey I had to make between my house and the studio, there was quite a bit of stress, and at times the streets of Toronto really felt a little bit like a war zone, or like a really unsettled zone. And I can see now that this decision that I made of being very, very focused in the work that I made, to choose one composition, to try to find one key composition, and to try to sort of expand it out with a difference, to try to think, okay, how many different ways can I embody this composition? How many different ways can I transverse through this composition? I can see it now. And I could be, I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but it now feels like I was looking for some kind of sense of groundedness and some sense of familiarity or some sense of acquaintance within the work that I was doing in the residency, as everything else seemed quite uncertain, and as our sense of connection had really shifted. The second sort of, so I worked with this composition, and going off of that composition, I decided to begin experimenting with a series of calligraphy books that I used to work through as I was a child in Guatemala. Before I came to Canada, we were always given these series of commercial writing / handwriting workbooks that we had to fill out. And over the years, my grandma had sort of bought new versions of them for me and sent them for me. And I, for a while, thought that I wanted to use them as some kind of ready-made. But it wasn't until I was in the residency that I began to realize that perhaps because this was a print object, because I was in a print context, that this might be the place where I might be able to explore it. So I worked with sort of extrapolating certain visual elements from those calligraphy notebooks, and I was looking for echoes between the visual elements in the calligraphy and the visual elements in this drawing that I had made in a way, not thinking about where I had come from, not thinking about these very elementary traces that I had started with. Because in a way, that my very earliest form of drawing were these abstract sort of calligraphy exercises. And so working from excerpting to then excerpting these visual elements and then multiplying them using the content aware function, to then thinking about how to really create that kind of all over composition with them. yielded the second set of prints, that are in the show, which are called Workbook. As these two, as Heather and I were working on these two prints, I decided that I really wanted to stick to a kind of very definite palette, and that what the sort of point of the different iterations of this varied edition was going to be was to find many different almost moves through the composition. So you can see on the left-hand side the very first digital study that I made to figure out how I would hand color the prints, and then many versions of these digital studies. I really, because there is still a certain, because prints that you make from a photolitho plate are not something that is infinitely available. We had like a good 15. I wanted to really think and study and rehearse how I would approach them. So I used these digital studies. So this is the very first one I made, and this is just about the last one I made. We had a really fun time printing with Heather. She was incredible. And then I took the prints back to my studio because I needed a sense of sort of a different sense of rootedness. And I really wanted for my hand to be the one that was going through them. And I was coloring them throughout the day. And that's basically the story of how this show came together. You can see some views, you can see some of the varied edition of prints, which in a way almost became drawings again. So one of the really interesting surprises, and we only really realized this with Rebecca at the very end, was that I had gone from drawing to print, and in a way all the way back to drawing. These the ones that are in color are photolithographies that are hand colored with ink on Fabriano paper. Actually, I'll show you. So these are photolithographies that are hand colored with RGB, red, green, and blue ink on Fabriano paper. These are, a sort of gray, black on gray version that's on Arches paper. And this is a blue version, which is the same blue as the workbook prints, also on Fabriano. There's one more, which is the which was done in a beautiful Japanese tissue paper that I recommend you go see, because that one moves. The very last thing I wanted to say was that because this is the first time I have the opportunity and the privilege to be showing in the two places that I am from now at the same time. So there's the show in Toronto with a difference, and then there's the exhibition at SFU Galleries, which is called Who Claims Abstraction. And at some point I realized that I wanted these shows to have a relationship, to speak to each other. And it was mostly through picking up cues from some of the contours from that drawing and manifesting them in very different ways that I managed to do this. The book that's coming out next week through SFU Galleries and Publication Studio brings together the idea of these both shows happening at the same time. And so that publication is called Who Claims Abstraction, like the show here, with a difference, like the show in Toronto. Who Claims Abstraction with a difference. And with that, I leave you for my part. I'll hand it over to Gordon, and Gordon I am the clicker of the slides, so you will tell me where to go.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a lot of very valuable information in terms of what I'm also addressing in these works. When I saw Francisco's piece in the Tech Gallery, I had this sense of, or actually it was an image of it, I had this kind of sense of recognition, and I thought, I've seen his work on Facebook and so forth, but there's something else going on here. And I realized that the format, as I mentioned to you in email, the format of these very, very large rectangular forms with a window at the end was very similar to a kind of format that I've been using for quite a long time. And what we're going to get back to this image eventually, but I just wanted to put it up there to indicate that that's kind of the meeting point of our two ideas. I think it more of as a confluence rather than an influence, but I love that kind of coincidental arrival at a point, which is actually quite a unique thing to me, to find that actually happening. So I'll get you to move to the next slide, Francisco. I'm glad you also covered quite a bit of the territory about how you moved into being an artist. And I think in terms of composition, one of the things that I do think about a lot is the composition of the artist himself or herself or themselves. How does that actually happen? Because it does start to happen at an early age. There's this sense that one wants to be doing something. So I did a lot of drawing when I was a kid. I drew a lot of horses because I lived on off and on between two farms in the family that had horses on them. I loved horses, so I drew a lot of horses. But when it finally came time to want to become an artist, I was not encouraged to do that. Now, a little background, I grew up on the prairies in Manitoba. So right off the bat, I had this interest about prepositions that define space, boundaries that define space. So one geographical space versus a legal space based on just a simple proposition or preposition and a name. The prairies themselves in the 1950s and 60s were very rural. Even Winnipeg was a fairly rural type of a city, which was the closest city to me. And the sense there was that you were going to, if you lived in a rural part of Canada, you were probably going to be a rural kind of a person. So in 2005, I was part of a conference at the University of Manitoba and met with Robert Croce, the poet from Alberta. And he had just published a new version of his famous long poem, prairie long poem, called Seed Catalog. And in it, there is a bit of a poem. I'm just going to read from part of it because it really encapsulates that kind of an attitude that existed on the prairies when you looked like maybe you were going to pursue something kind of useless and pointless, such as art or writing, instead of a really good involvement in the community. So Robert Croce had actually received some sort of recognition for a poem that he had submitted to a journal or to somewhere, and was quite proud of it. And his father says to him, I'm just going to read from print here, son, this is a crowbar. This is a willow fence post. This is a sledge. This is a roll of barbed wire. This is a bag of staples. This is a claw hammer. We give form to this land by running a series of posts and 3 strands of barbed wire around a quarter section. First off, I want you to take the crowbar and drive 1,156 holes in that gumbo. And the next time you want to write a poem, we'll start the haying. And I thought that encapsulated so much the idea not only of the space that we were dealing with, the time that we were dealing with, but just the general attitudes that were not conducive to becoming an artist or a writer. At the same time, Margaret Atwood had come out with her study of Canadian literature called Survival. And those two influences, even though they occurred at different times, were really quite significant to me. My own circumstances, etc., had me living a relatively isolated life. The things I wanted to do, I had been born blind in one eye, so I just couldn't become part of some kinds of things that needed to be done. So I ended up in these 3 images represent sort of stages of my own composition, self-composition as an artist. And the first one talks about the my love of actually being outdoors in a different kind of a boundary, the Northwest Ontario Great Canadian Shield, which is another form of massive geographical boundary setting in Canada. It was the same time that I was actually in the BFA program at the University of Calgary, and I was really studying deeply the this kind of a context. Calgary, of course, in those days you might not think was very culturally advanced, but it really was. The University of Calgary was a fantastic choice for me. I worked with John Will, printmaker, Bill Lang, also a printmaker, Naboro Sawai, names which are possibly recognizable as some of the people in the audience. I took an etching course from Rita McCoe, who was also doing fabulous sculptural installations and musical performances. So it was a very lively time, much different than when I first started university back in the late 60s in Winnipeg. And as I said, I kind of blundered my way through a couple of years of earth science before I realized that it really wasn't what I wanted to do. But a lot of that earth science was spent out working in the bush in the summer. By 1989, when I was finished my MFA, the third image is from a still of a video that John Will did called Mondo Limbo Meo Meo. And there's one, I don't know if you've ever seen any of his videos, but they are quite ramshackle performances, etc. And I was the figure of John the Revelator, St. John, who wrote the book of Revelations, apparently. And the middle one was an image of myself as the man symbol from the Book of Durrow, the Irish Book of Durrow. So between these two or three images, I basically wanted to talk a little bit about the construction or the making of yourself as an artist. One of the things I do talk about when I'm teaching is that all of your work is in fact a self-portrait. Your whole body of work becomes a self-portrait of your life, and the closer you can get to that self-portrait of your work and your sense of yourself, the better you're going to be making work. And I think that's one of the things I see in Francisco's development, is that there is this sense in his work that this is a self-portrait of the artist as a developing person. And I really, really like that. I'll go to the next slide here. So I don't want to ramble on too much. At the University of Calgary, I was starting to look for form in the work that I was doing. I did a lot of drawing, did a double major in printmaking and drawing, silk screening, lithography, and talio and drawing, and of course the art history component as well. In Calgary, I happen to live across from a cathedral. It's not Chartres by any stretch of the imagination, but it was quite a dominant landmark in the otherwise fairly industrial area that I lived in, St. Mary's Cathedral. And I started just doing drawings of it as a potential exploration of form. And even in on the far right, you can start to see that horizontal component beginning to be quite strong. I did quite a few of these as part of my exploration of how to go from drawing. There's a lot of exploration materials going on here to form, and some of this got translated into print, others just stayed as drawings. We'll move to the next slide. And this little figure I used quite often in my work, just to talk about my own journey, because what I think a lot of we experience, and certainly Francisco as well, the idea that we're somewhat nomadic in this, in this planet, as it were, moving from place to place to place, searching for that sense of rootedness or whatever that we might need to do the work. Anyway, this is possibly prescient. I was already anticipating perhaps moving further west to Vancouver, and that's exactly what happened in 1989 when I did move west. So here we have the little man moving along. Next slide. Oh, that's, by the way, that is a lithograph and silkscreen combination. So it was actually combined. This is all, that little figure there is all silkscreened onto a lithograph. So it was a bit of an exercise in very, very tight registration, believe me. Next slide, though. In 1998, I think it was, I was in Scotland with Lesley, and we did a trip across from Scotland to Ireland. And as I was traveling, I tended to take a lot of photographs. And having gone through a series of photographs that I had taken elsewhere, I began to notice that there was often themes of structure and so forth going on in the photographs. These pieces, or this particular piece, it's called The Big Blur, was the biggest piece I'd ever worked on. And it's actually 3 panels that are put together on 3/4-inch plywood. So I was moving from paper to a more malleable surface as far as that goes. The center panel is a piece of steel, so the whole thing weighed quite a lot. But it was the structure of the Cork Cathedral and the structure of this end of a hedge at Crathy's Castle in Scotland that struck me as being very, very similar. And I began to look for these symmetries of observation, if you want to call it that, in the kinds of things that I was looking at. The central panel was taken, just a series of snapshots taken out of the car window as we roared up from wherever it was we were in Scotland back to Aberdeen. And this piece set kind of the form that I was going to work on for quite some time, the actual formal qualities of that composition. I liked the horizontality of it. It reminded me of my experience on the prairies. And it really, really felt that I was actually getting somewhere with what I was doing. I had the space at Langara, the huge studio there in the winter, summertime to work in, and it allowed me to get into that big work that I wanted to try doing. Screen printing primarily, but there's a lot of drawing going on in these pieces. For example, I started to layer layers and layers and layers of images of the same image, actually, but in different colors. I would use rollers to put gloss into certain areas on the print that I wanted to reflect under certain kinds of lights. This is one of the downsides of looking at digital images. You don't always get all of the information that is actually there. I was also introducing text into the wet ink. I was writing and drawing into the wet ink with pens or nibs and bits of pieces of cloth and things like that, so that what you see here is actually much more complicated when you get closer to the actual image. I'll look at the next image. So keep going on here. So this body of work evolved into what I called long prairie poems. The first one, Picked Bridge, is again an image from Scotland on the left wing, a bridge in Dublin on the other with that arched form. The little figure in the middle is sort of the new little man, if you want to call him that. He was a tiny little ceramics piece of whatever, it might have been a piece of toy, a little statue or something at one time. Just a little figurine with no head, it was on a beach. And that became a little symbol for a while that I was working with. The middle image called Sticks Stones, standing stones in Orkney, and what they call dolphins in the river of the Fraser River. The central panel looking out a window in Stromness. The bottom image was taken near my studio, or worked from near my studio. These are all screen printing on wood again, and with steel centers, a very thin steel bonded to wood on the centers. These benches were outside a laundromat near my studio. The central bench on the bottom image there is looking out over at the sound of Ronaldsay, I think it is, from the island of South Ronaldsay in Orkney. So just working with these symmetries across space and time, which I really, really enjoyed doing. And I mentioned that in my discussion before, or before we even did this today, those trajectories of time and space and what I call luck, just being in the right place at the right time. So this will bring me to one more, the next slide. Just talk a little bit about that more. This piece on the bottom here is called Magnus Cathedral, and this is sort of gives you an idea of how I compose these. I have the original images. The two outside images were actually outhouses, or what should have been outhouses, in a park in the Fraser Valley near Clinton, BC. There had been plans to build a park in this grassland, which was very, very fragile. The people who lived there objected to it. Parks Canada had already ordered the outhouses, and they're sitting in a parking lot in Clinton, so they sold them to the ranchers for $100 a piece or something, just to get rid of them. And they set them out on this parkland area to keep feed in and as a temporary or emergency shelter. So the central image is the main door to Magnus Cathedral in Orkney, in Kirkwall in Orkney. And I just put it all together as this kind of sense of these structures that speak to the space that they're in and dominate it somehow, even though they're half a world apart. Again, the central panel is steel. These are all about 4 feet long. So that's how I would construct it. And as you can see, I'm not trying to reconstruct a photograph as a print. All the color and so forth that is in here is all added as drawing, removing of surfaces, sanding down of surfaces, rollering on layers of glaze. And the photograph itself is really just a structure on which I build the drawing component of it. So the next slide takes us to the piece that I was started with. Again, here's the construction, keep calling it the construction because that's what it is. The organization of the information. And this was taken, these images were taken from a trip to a friend's cabin up on Lake Lillooet, pre-pandemic. And this is how I set it up. At some point I stopped working on 3/4 inch plywood because it was just too heavy, and started working on cradle panels. Again, a steel piece in the center. And the process is very, very straightforward printmaking. These are my screens. I screen onto an image, and then I work back into that image. For example, with the steel, I've got it sitting out on the roof of the carport in the rain to see what'll happen with rust. And when these pieces are done individually, they are fastened together as the final piece. The next slide, please, if I can ask you. There we go. In the process of actually developing this, there are some very beautiful drawings that happen and then disappear because of the process moving on to the next step. So, for example, this central panel here on the bottom, at one point, that's what it looked like. And I really loved going back into these surfaces and removing elements of them, putting them back in again in a different kind of a form. So this repetitive screen printing of the same image, but manipulating it in the meantime with drawing, is to me kind of what you're addressing yourself, Francisco, the idea of drawing and printmaking working together to produce these. So these are unique prints. They would be impossible to edition. So this piece is called Untitled, and this is what the bottom image here is what it actually looks like just under normal light. But if you move to the next slide, the final layering that went onto this piece here was done with light, or with ink that's, what do you call it? You can only see it under ultraviolet light. Forget the word for that. But it's very, it's screen printed on. It's minimally visible under normal light. But over the course of a day, if there's sun shining on this piece, as it gets dark, the actual text is temporarily, very, very shortly visible. And or you can actually just shine an ultraviolet light on it, as I had to do here to get the actual photograph. The text itself refers to the history of this particular place. It is on Lillooet territory, Lillooet as they call it, just outside of Pemberton. And in May of 1911, the Lillooet Nation delivered a declaration to the government of British Columbia, claiming their land and being somewhat critical of what was being done to it by settlers and colonizers. It was a very, very moving document to read, because 110 years later, the same kinds of problems they were addressing then still continue to be problems. And I wanted somehow to acknowledge that this beautiful landscape does have a history that is not visible in the work itself. So the text of the declaration is screen printed on this, on the left-hand side, most of the text, and on the right-hand side are the lists of all the names of the chiefs and where the declaration was signed in Spence's Bridge in 1911. Yes, hoping that if people see that image there, or the date and the location, if they Google it, they will immediately come up to the declaration, the Lillooet Declaration itself, and can read the text and understand the relationship to the land itself. So this is in a private collection. I don't know if it'll ever be seen in public other than by people who go to this particular cabin. I had some concerns about appropriating this information, but I was relatively sort of made to understand that it would be okay, because it was being done respectfully and in relationship to the actual sources of the imagery and its history. So that is really what I've been doing with drawing and printmaking over probably the last 20 odd years. And hope I haven't dragged on too long here. I know I have. Over to you, Francisco.
Well, we will hand it over to Lesley, and I'm just going to test that I can do the back and forth thing. Thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you so much for this journey. Lesley, anytime.
Francisco, would you like me to make this quick? I see that we're already at 10.
Take your time.
Okay.
I'm not in a rush. And,
okay.
People will stay with us. If people have to go, they can head.
Okay.
And the recording will allow people to
do that.
Come back to it.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this discussion. We met back in the drawing studio at the very beginning of your journey in Canada, and I was teaching drawing, and I taught drawing really with, very influenced by the way I worked myself. Glasgow Art School, where I had gone at the tender age of 17, not now, but then it had this discipline of every day you drew from life from 4 till 6. And I think it just became a foundation in me. That's what you did. Every time you needed to think about work or whatever, drawing was the habit that I sort of had absorbed. I liked your diagram, and I feel that very much encompasses what drawing is, because there's no such thing as a good drawing, a bad drawing. A drawing is really about looking, if we're talking about from life. And in fact, even if we're not really, it's about a sustained investment of time, observation, process. Then you start to maybe put down a mark and plot that, if you're working on paper or if you're working on a wall like you are sometimes, you start to make the mark, and out of that comes the composition. I tend to have the notion that a drawing where you go straight to the middle of the paper, start filling it in and working out, is it's a different kind of drawing. It's more, I would say it's more a study or something. Anyway, but talking about drawing out the information from what you're looking at, this is the approach. I've started with these ones from Whistler. I grew up in Scotland and went to Glasgow School of Art. It was, I went into drawing and painting, and I worked a lot from landscape there and loved it. And it was only when I got a sort of a scholarship to go to Cyprus, I was so struck by the light and the color and the difference of the landscape that it really, that's what's actually held my interest, is what all these different landforms offer and how they ultimately dictate the way the painting goes. So we met, I think I had this exhibition of the Whistler paintings, and these are the drawings. So I begin with drawings on site. I start by looking, walking. It's funny, you go to Whistler, it's overwhelmingly huge, especially if you're not a skier or anything. It's like it's big all around. So you're not going to draw all of that. You come into what is pertinent to you and what captures the space to you. So I begin with these drawings, and at school, I think you've been flicking through them. They then, by the plotting of the marks, like this takes me into a painting. And I know this is about drawing into printmaking, but I think there are definitely similarities wherever you move. My sense from this landscape was it was vast, expansive, and me filling in every tree that was in there was only going to close it down. And so I very much put the investment into the mark. It almost became like a kind of calligraphic type drawn mark. And then the color, although drawn from nature, it is enhanced and developed into it becoming a unique palette that sort of represents that place. And I see that especially in your one in SFU, Francisco. The color is dragged out of that landscape, but chromatically very much enhanced. So that's these ones. And I think drawing is a lot about as much as what you leave out as what you put in. And very often, if you're talking about representation, you're drawing around what's there rather than what is there. What is the shadow that's cast? And it does start to take on an abstraction, although, I'd be cautious in using that word because I always do reference the landscape. But once back in the studio and just working with paint, you can move into that beautiful freedom of what mark, color, paint does, and that becomes much more abstract. So we can move right along. Then I had the opportunity to go to Palm Springs, which I sort of slightly, was a little bit indifferent to, but beggars can be choosers, and an opportunity for going away was too enticing. So when I got there, what struck me was the moment you stepped off the plane, you were practically blinded by the light. And I eventually, we did walking and, some hiking and stuff around, we settled in this oasis area, of which there are many. And it just seemed to embody that place, that there is huge expanses of somewhat barren land, and then these little pockets, obviously where there was water, that it was intensely rich and fluid. So the mark making, unlike in Whistler, becomes much bolder and hopefully, translating the drama between the slabs of shadow and then the heightened bits of color, and then this relentless blue sky, which had a huge presence. And really, when the sun was behind a rock form, you're kind of blinded as to what you see. So I wanted to kind of capture that. And then if we keep moving, Francisco, these are drawings, and that's another drawing, just more looking up. And then they shifted into the paintings. They look a bit bleached out on my screen. I hope they're better in yours. But then using the drawings and the mark as a departure point for the paint, and then further developing the palette to sort of try and express the sense of place, the memory of the place, and, you know, just my engagement with it. And yeah, certainly there was pockets that were very dark, and then there's pockets that are very, very bright. And I think, you know, these paintings definitely come from the primary observation in the drawing. I don't think I would get to a painting like that had I not sort of exhausted myself in observation through drawing, because drawing, you know, by the very definition of the word, you're drawing out what is pertinent. You're not just loading it up with every bit of information. And then I put in this final little body of work that I did very recently, last fall, actually, on Galliano. We had a cabin up at the north end, and that is, a, you know, in theory, that's a landscape that's more familiar to us because we live on the West Coast. But again, very, very unique and very dense. And I guess it was the fall, it was the end of the season. The foliage was almost impenetrable. So that was set about its own challenges. And yet I wanted to kind of keep going, keep the space happening. So again, it's got a lot to do with sitting, looking, slowly making the marks, and then ultimately a composition emerges. And hopefully you've got some kind of clarity of key forms to then go and work with. And I think we have a few examples of the paintings that came out of that. And you know, in sort of the same thing that you were talking about, Francisco, and same with Gordon, you know, the painting goes through many journeys. It looks many things along the way, and then you obliterate, and then you pull out, you go back to the drawing to find some structure, and then you let it go again. So I think that's actually, that's another one of the same place. And then there's a picture of me in action. And the critical thing is, I think the experience. I think it had a lot to do with my background growing up in Scotland. We were out a lot. There's a very strong landscape tradition of painting, which, you know, has obviously got, you know, had various moments of being acknowledged or not so, but I feel it's been a valid source, and it provides me with ultimately this kind of wonderful matrix to explore drawing and painting. I think that's, I've made my mark as quick as I could. And I recognize, you know, God, you were an amazing student when you were there. And it's very wonderful to see how you've taken those, you know, somewhat basic principles and ran with them. And I love the way they're evolving in the many forms that you're doing. But they have the integrity that they have because you do look, you're not just working directly from a photograph or a, you know, you know, you're the one that's taking the information. So that's, I think we should have a discussion.
Thank you so much.
I feel as though we've run out of time.
Thank you both so much. I mean, can I just make a comment and pose a question, and then we open it up? Is that okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's fine. I was going to say maybe we can open the discussion up more widely as you guys are discussing as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, by all means, start the conversation.
Well, I think that the really thank you both so much for.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
This gift. I think there's a couple of things that are important to me. One is that I think in a way that the basicness of these principles is what makes them really, really, really important, because they are in a way a place to go back to. In terms of even not just my aesthetics as an artist, but even my politics as a person who came to this country as a refugee, who's trying to be a critical citizen, who's trying to think critically about, you know, the place that we're at. I think my earliest, there's a fantastic phrase by Gayatri Spivak who talks about honoring what you cannot ever grasp, you know, which I think for me is a kind of basis for the ability of being together in ways that are not necessarily colonial. I think one of my earliest intuitions of that is this careful, thoughtful, sustained, but never in a way aggressive approach to observing space. And I think internalizing that it has in part made me able to translate that into not just my aesthetics, but in a way a certain kind of politics around that, like you were saying, Gordon, acknowledging, asking, researching. The question that I have is, you know, in terms of going out and experiencing things and then bringing them back to the studio, it's a kind of retreat, in a way. You know, like I think we might have in common that we go out and then we sort of retreat to a space.
Yeah.
Is the space of going back into the studio, what is it that shifts for you? Is it because the observation is what we carry, but is it the relationship between the mark making? Is it that you can explore the mark making? Is it that you explore the composition? Like, how do you start with observation and then and then it goes to the other two, or how does it work for you?
Do you want me to start with that? The studio is, to me, it is that workspace, I guess is what I'm getting at. But a great deal of the construction or the thinking about the process is always going on in my head. And then when I finally get into the studio and start to do the work, it has to work. It has to be done in stages, etc. So it is a bit of a retreat, but to me, it is the workspace. The bulk of the work has already been done through observation and thinking and looking at how images work together, etc. So I think my sense is that the studio is a workspace. It's being out and looking at the world is actually the observation is the actual hard, not the hard work, but the bulk of the work. What do you think, Lesley?
For me, going into the studio, I've sort of done the looking, the drawing. I'm in a great position to just move on to the painting, and for a while I kind of forget the drawing. It's more about the memory of the place, the freedom of the paint, and what different fusions of color then suggest, and I run with that for a bit. And then the drawing is the bit that I reference back to, if to keep some kind of underlying structure, and I do that to varying degrees throughout the decades of working. Sometimes they're very happily left in a much more ambiguous point, and other points I do kind of recover. So I think there's a certain freedom coming back into the studio and, opening up. And I always work on several paintings at one time. So there's a fluidity and a movement that's exciting.
Well, I think movement becomes the ability to move, just having the room to move.
Yes.
Becomes important.
Yeah.
Rebecca, did you have any questions, or were there questions that we wanted to field before we?
I guess I had a question for you, and maybe it will feed into Gordon and Lesley's work too, but the kind of transition between working in different mediums and how you go through those processes. And for you in particular, having been through a residency where you've reconnected with printmaking, as you said, almost come full circle, where your prints have become these hand-colored almost drawings again, and how you feel like you'll take what you've learned in the printmaking studio forward into the rest of your work, and whether that's in drawing or in performance or in whatever way.
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think in some ways it goes back to this ability to move, and sometimes, especially as you are an artist over time, if you sort of like really focus in on one end of things for a period of time, you kind of need, it's about perhaps symmetry is hard in life, but balance can be achieved by sort of like, leaning into a different space. And so I've taken a couple of quite sort of big swings in the 18 years that I've been an artist. But I think the important thing for me, and something that was really key, was that Gordon and Lesley were actually very supportive of me embracing performance, and and encouraging, and in a way that I wouldn't have necessarily known whether that would be the case, because we worked very traditionally at Langara, and I was sort of like starting out doing these quite out there things, and there was always a sense of support. So I think I've been fortunate to feel like I can move, like in a way. I spent a really long time doing performance, then I came back to drawing, and I had been creating all of these more sort of digitally printed and fabricated site-specific manifestations of my compositions, and being able to sort of like bring it back to my body and bring it back to something I could hold was really important, partly because of my trajectory, but also again partly because of the moment. Like for a while there, it was really difficult to move through the city. It was really difficult to get close to people, and so I needed, the best way I can put it is that I needed something I could hold, and With the Difference gave me a way of making something I could hold again.
I guess one of the other things that we talked about with this exhibition and with print in particular was that you came out of the residency with multiples. And that was one of the big sort of differences in the way that you'd worked before, was that you had these editions of 15, 10 prints that you could then create these kind of varied approaches. You could kind of treat them in different ways. Do you want to speak a little bit about kind of how you'd approach multiples again? Or Gordon and Lesley also, whether you have more experience working with multiples of images?
Well, I can jump in on that as a printmaker, because the work I was showing in these slides, those for the most part they're one-offs, just because of the processes, etc. But I have a very small studio now with a rather large etching press in it, and one of the spin-offs that I've managed through over the years is, as I'm traveling around in different places, I'll pick up bits and pieces of stuff and just bring it home. And I've got this large collection of pieces of rope with knots in them, and little skulls and bones and stuff. And I've recently, over the last couple of years, I set up little still lifes in the studio itself. They're very small, just of what I call entanglements. And I do mezzotints of those. There are 3-inch square plates, which are actually they're beautiful to work on. I don't know if people do mezzotints much anymore, but you have to actually rock the plate and get it full of pits, and then you burnish the image. But it's a form of drawing where actually literally pulling the image out of the blackness of that plate. So you're pulling the light out again. And I print those as editions, so I still do editioned work, and I actually find it extremely meditative. So back and forth, the biggest media change for me is working with computers. I mean, I was born before television, so so this has been really quite a tool that I would never have thought about when I was actually in Calgary. I mean, it simply didn't exist. So the ability to work with digital components and traditional components, I find that extremely attractive. And I like the way that Francisco has approached it as well. I think that's, to me, when I was looking at his SFU piece and just looking at it very closely, I got that fantastic sense of the planning that had to go into this printed component just to make it fit. I was really, really impressed. I mean, I thought, this is the kind of print that you could not possibly do with the traditional method. And that's one of the things you mentioned, just couldn't be possible. So the editioning component of it is actually quite nice too. I like to see those smaller pieces.
I'm glad you brought up the mix of analog and digital work in your work and in Francisco-Fernando's. One of the things I thought was interesting, you always get tuned in when you are working with an artist and they're thinking about certain things. You start to notice like news stories or see it in other places as well. And one of the things I found interesting was that they just announced they're going to bring back cursive in schools in Ontario as a mandatory requirement. And I hadn't really thought about handwriting in the longest time until Francisco-Fernando and I were talking about the show, and it came down to this book from learning cursive at school, and that was the kind of root of some of the prints in the show. But they talked about the idea of like the handwritten, kind of handwritten expression being something that can help kind of develop critical thinking and spatial awareness and things like that. And I think that's such an interesting kind of news story that's coming along at the same time as you're both talking about like what digital media can give you, but also the importance of immediacy, of being in an environment, of responding to it, of distilling it, of drawing by hand, printing by hand. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up as a sort of general observation point in connection with a news kind of current story.
Well, for me, I think on one hand, I wanted to really acknowledge printmaking, and I really wanted to, because I come from where I come from in terms of my training, but I also wanted to sort of be a little bit playful with it and sort of do, so working with Heather has a really incredible sort of sense of technical precision, of doing things that to a standard, and so I wanted to acknowledge that, and I think we did that with some of the the variations that are not hand colored. But I wanted to sort of also, in a way, break out from that and create something that was a kind of strange kind of in between thing. Where in the end, I think in conversation with you, Rebecca, we figured out, oh, these are really kind of more like drawings. The other thing that I've done in the show that's a bit of a kind of shows perhaps my more rebellious side is, we're showing a lot of the research that I did throughout the exhibition, which includes sort of like cheaply printed inkjet on very non-archival paper studies, so I wanted to acknowledge, but then I also perhaps wanted to challenge a little bit. The advantage of working digitally is that if you only have one tablet like I do, is that I can go from one drawing to the next quite quickly, and I can move quite expeditiously. But I really wanted, I think, in making something that I could hold again and thinking about with a difference as a series of multiples, I really wanted to get back to what Lesley was talking about in terms of being able to have different things all at the same time. I mean, that's how we would get set up in the painting studio at Langara. Like if you got there on time and you were, you had your 4 easels, and you could move through the picture planes, and and so this was, and I have a very limited space, and by the time I brought things back and I decided that I really needed to hand color these at home, I have a cozy space, but I could really kind of play with them and lay them out, and it was a really exciting experience to kind of have the best of both worlds, something I could hold, but also something I could move through.
Good, yeah. One of the things I enjoy with working with digital technology is that the computer makes decisions that sometimes I argue with, because when I'm making these large transparencies, I have to print them off in sections and then splice them together to make a large transparency that I can then use to make a silkscreen screen and then print, etc. But I can take a photograph and break it down into sections and then print them off, and they seem to be at different light. The light in one is darker than the light in another. After a while, I just worked with it because it lays out this very interesting grid in the actual piece that I didn't put there. The computer put it there. The digital printout put it there. And I like that accident of technologies meeting and somehow managing to work together. One piece I did in particular, it has a large piece of a large image of a slough in Saskatchewan, which is broken up by this grid, which is almost exactly squares, and it really mirrors the way that the prairies were first surveyed into these squares called sections. And I thought, this is such a fantastic use of a fantastic accident of space imposing itself on a plane through digital accidents. And I love those accidents. They're not immediately apparent when you're looking at an image on a screen, but when you see the real image, you think, well, holy cow, that's something else.
Well, and maybe that's what's at stake in translation, right? Like all the way in which difference moves through a kind of layering in your work, Gordon,
Yes.
does give a sense of an atmosphere. Or looking at those at the especially the drawings from Oasis, Lesley, that the sort of economy, but also the intensity of that blue really gets across the intensity without it being sort of like a blue monochrome,
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll probably bring the conversation, I think, to a close. I'm just conscious of everyone's time.
Yes.
But I think all of you spoke so beautifully about sort of symmetries of observation, of like distilling experience into something that you can hold in your hands. And I think that comes through in all of your work, and you spoke about it so beautifully. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing your artworks and sharing your experiences of the residency, Francisco, but also your teaching experiences. And I think this also shows how important foundationally teaching is in the way that you choose to practice. And yeah, those connections I don't think can be overstated.
And access to learning.
Yeah, access to learning, absolutely. And yeah, so thank you everyone so much for joining.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I'm just
so
a little sign off to everybody. But our current exhibitions, including Francisco-Fernando show, is which is currently on in our main gallery, will run through July 22nd. So please do come and visit us if you haven't seen the show already. Laura's sharing some links in the chat to various things. If you missed the previous Print Speak talks, we archive them all online. They're available on our website and on our YouTube channel, and we'll aim to get this one edited and up in the next few weeks. But mainly just thank you to everyone for joining us today, for your input and your interest. Thanks again to the three of you for speaking so eloquently about your practices. And we'll just sort of sign off there and say, have a great rest of your day. Hope it's not too hot where you are.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
yeah, I look forward hopefully to meeting some of you at some point in Francisco-Fernando's show.